Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aaron Woodrick, the director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Domestic Policy Program. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on the benefits and trade-offs of breaking down internal trade barriers in Canada, based on a recent paper published by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. To have that discussion, we're very pleased to be joined by the authors of that paper, who I will introduce shortly. But before, I wanted to introduce a special guest who will be giving some opening remarks to kick things off for us. Now, the Premier of Alberta doesn't need much introduction, but I wanted to take the opportunity to thank the Premier and the Government of Alberta for its support of MLI and this project in particular, which has allowed us to commission such esteemed experts to produce a report on an issue I think everyone will agree is of great importance to the future of Canada's economic well-being. Finally, on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, I'd also like to thank you, Premier, for your service to Alberta and to Canada over the last 25 years. And as you move on from the premiership, wish you all the best in your future endeavors. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to you for some opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, the Premier of Alberta, the Honourable Jason Kenney.
Thanks very much, Aaron. You can hear me all right?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you to you and the team at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I've always had great regard for MLI and the thoughtful, independent perspective it brings to public policy in Canada. And thanks as well for, in particular, being champions of internal trade. I'd like to thank Ryan and as well Trevor for their good work in this study that we commissioned through you. As you know, the government that I lead has been a huge champion of the vision of achieving the economic union in Canada, which was really the reason Confederation happened in the 1860s was partly as a security pact against our southern neighbors, but also partly to realize the great benefits of internal trade and breaking down barriers between the then British North American colonies. And it's sad to me that after 150 years of Confederation, we still have not fully achieved that vision of an economic union because of ongoing barriers to the mobility of goods, services, and people. And this is something I champion as in federal government. I always used to say around the federal cabinet table that we had constitutional superpowers that we could use to ensure an economic union. And unfortunately, there's always reasons not to do that, for the federal government not to use those powers. It's a message I sent to Prime Minister Trudeau 3 days after I became Premier in 2019. I was in his office in Ottawa and said, look, we support robust provinces within the Canadian Constitution, but for each level of government to stay in its lane. And one thing that's, I believe, in the federal government's lane is the constitutional authority to ensure free trade. But we decided unilaterally to start taking action to accelerate this. There has been progress. The Canada Free Trade Agreement 2017 was certainly an improvement over its predecessor agreement. But as you know, the provinces and the federal government filed hundreds of exceptions under the CFTA. Alberta was one of the worst actors in that respect, which is why at the Council of the Federation meeting with the premiers in Saskatoon in the summer of 2019, I announced that we were going unilaterally, cold turkey, no haggling, no negotiating. We were just going to, by fiat, eliminate nearly 90% of Alberta's exemptions under the CFTA, and to go from, I believe it was 28 to 6 exceptions. And the remaining 6, every few months, I go back and look at those to see if there's any more we can eliminate. They're there largely for international legal trade reasons. So really don't constitute barriers to domestic trade. So we also announced that in 2019 that we were going to look seriously at the idea of unilaterally recognizing professional credentials from other provinces and accelerating that process. And I believe Professor Tombe did some research for us indirectly on that as well. C.D. Howe Institute did a report demonstrating that the costliest element of internal trade barriers actually is found in the barriers to labor mobility. Alberta obviously has been a great beneficiary of domestic labor mobility through our modern economic history. That was underscored in the release yesterday of StatsCan data that demonstrating that in the second quarter of this year, we had the largest population growth of any quarter on decade, largely because of a huge and I think sustained growth in net interprovincial migration. But that we don't, we don't advocate for streamlining credentialing simply because it's in our short-term interests. But we think all of these things make us all better off, and that's really the point made in this study that you've hosted, that you've coordinated on the concept of mutual recognition of regulations. The study, as you know, points out to the fact that we could possibly increase Canadian economic output by between 4.4 and 7.9%, which would increase our national economic output by between 110 and 200 billion dollars. Now, as you know, there is a regulatory reconciliation and cooperation table at the Council of the Federation, where the provinces grind through at a mind-numbingly slow pace the process of seeking to harmonize regs. Infamously, this led to a situation at the Whitehorse COP meeting in 2017 of the country's first ministers haggling for 2 hours over what should be included in a standard first aid kit. And my view is this, that the RCT work should carry on, but we are never going to get anywhere close to an ambitious scale of regulatory harmonization in the country if we are grinding through thousands of different sectors involving collectively millions of different provincial regulations. Instead, we should completely change the framework here. And that would be to adopt the Australian approach, and the paper points to this, where the Australian states recognize the validity, the high quality of the regs across the economy of their sister states in the Australian Commonwealth. Why can't we do that in Canada? I always say this about labor mobility, that if you're an Albertan that gets sick in Nova Scotia, you don't ask if the physician has a Alberta medical license. If you are an Ontarian and you find yourself in Quebec, you don't limit your services to a Ontario registered dentist. So why do we even need to do a separate a process for validation of professional credentials in the provinces, with the exception of a handful of occupations where there may be a significantly different scope of practice? Aaron, this is why earlier this year we passed Alberta's new Labor Mobility Act, which directs our 45 some professional regulatory organizations, the credentialing bodies, basically gives them a 2-week deadline to register, to certify and register a credentialed Canadian professional coming here from another province. And I'm happy to announce that we're now taking another step. We will shortly be publishing regs to further streamline that process, directing our regulatory bodies that they can no longer demand all sorts of ancillary documentation to register somebody moving here seeking credentialing, but all they need to do is demonstrate that they are a licensed professional in good standing of their relevant provincial organization. So doctor comes here from BC, just show us your BC medical license, prove it to us, and you don't need to send us your high school matriculation, your SAT scores, your undergraduate diploma. Like, just show us that you are a member in good standing in another province. But let me just close this by saying we sponsored the study. I announced this actually at the COF meeting in Victoria in June or July, because I'm really trying to get my fellow premiers to take this seriously. I think that the mutual approach, the Australian approach, the approach outlined in this study is the only sensible approach. It would take us literally decades to get to where we need to go on regulatory harmonization if we go at this on a piecemeal basis. And I'll just give you 2 concrete examples that I can think of. I was recently in Lloydminster, famously straddles the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, and they pointed out to me that a sandwich with bologna that's carved at a deli on the Alberta side of the border, if it's walked across to the Saskatchewan side and sold in a store, it's illegal, because the food processing has been done under Alberta regulation, But if it crosses the border, and it has not gone through a federally inspected meat plant, which are only for large-scale meat plants, then it cannot be sold on the Saskatchewan side of the border. This is so we've been trying to get in the western provinces, for example, interprovincial sale of provincially regulated meat products. But the feds step in and say, no, if you are a small scale craft butcher in Saskatchewan and you want to sell into Manitoba, you have to go through a huge federally regulated abattoir, which is just totally uneconomic. It's one example. And another example is that in 2019, this is an example of where the feds need to play a role. Premier Moe and I signed an MOU that led to harmonization of our regulations on the movement of service rigs, a big part of the oil and gas sector. Those rigs are generally parked for 90% of the time. They were being over-regulated as though they were like semi-trucks. So to reduce cost, cut red tape, we said, no, we're going to treat these totally differently, massively reduce the reporting, the regulatory, the oversight requirements for the movement of these service rigs. But again, if you're moving them between Saskatchewan and Alberta, suddenly it becomes a federally regulated issue of interprovincial transportation. And it took the feds 2 years to verify, ratify the decision of two provinces to harmonize their rigs. So we all need to be part of the solution. I've sent a copy of your study to every premier. I raised it again with them on our Council of the Federation meeting on Monday morning. I've just sent signed personal copies to them. We got an agreement at COF this summer to accelerate a table at the RCT on looking at mutual recognition. I will be, as you mentioned, Aaron, finishing my 25 years in public service shortly, so I won't be able to do this. But I do hope that Alberta or another province, if we cannot see multilateral momentum on mutual recognition of regs, I hope that Alberta or another province will do what we did on the CFTA exceptions and just go cold turkey. I believe the benefits of greater trade and liberalization are so great that playing this protectionist game of holding things back until you've negotiated the perfect agreement will get us nowhere. So I would urge a future Alberta government to look at unilaterally recognizing regs of other provinces so we can take a giant leap forward towards the dream of the economic union to make us all wealthier and to do it at no cost to taxpayers. That's one of the beautiful things about this as an economic policy lever. And with that, I'm looking forward to the panel.
Well, thank you so much for that, Premier. Very much appreciate your kind words and the railing us for some ridiculous anecdotes of the consequences of these barriers. It would perhaps be less funny if there wasn't an economic cost to it, but also to thank you for your leadership on this file. You walk the walk on this and act unilaterally while others stall, so that's very much appreciated. And yes, we absolutely hope you enjoy the rest of the panel. At this point, we'd like to bring in the authors to the study. So I'd like to introduce Trevor Tombe, who's a professor of economics at the University of Calgary, and Ryan Manucha, a Toronto-based lawyer, author, and frequent commentator on interprovincial trade issues. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. Looking forward to getting your thoughts. And I thought we might start with some opening thoughts. And I think, Ryan, perhaps we'll start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you, Premier Kenney. It's an honor to be here. It was an honor to write this paper with Professor Tombe. This is a very important topic, more important coming out of the pandemic and ascending global isolationism and an era where we're trying to eke out as much growth as we can given current conditions. And interprovincial trade has been a perennial issue, and there is no better time to bring focused attention to it now. It's always been one of those topics that requires sustained political leadership from the center. And Premier Kenney's actions for many years on this topic has encouraged a great deal of development. And now, as Premier Kenney alluded to at the beginning, interprovincial trade has been a topic since the dawn of this country. 1867, the founders of Canada had witnessed two external shocks that had really severely impacted them. One was the loss of imperial preferences, perhaps 20 years before that, and then in the 1840s with the repeal of the Corn Laws, which meant that Canada was at the mercy of global trade whims and had to look to one another to fill the gaps. And then once again, just before Confederation, when the U.S. abrogated on the Reciprocity Treaty. So Canada was very familiar with the issue of having to turn to one another to sort out, where is an engine of growth? It's looking internally, looking across our domestic borders. And since then, the project of the economic union has been chiefly one sustained through, the tool at play was using Section 121 of the Constitution Act to sort of break down internal barriers and perhaps political alliances in an ad hoc fashion. And it wasn't until perhaps a quarter century ago that there was the dawn of, it was in the era of ascendant global multilateralism, where we saw multiple rounds of negotiation, the Uruguay round, the WTO, 1994. In that time frame was birthed Canada's very first own free trade agreement, the Agreement on Internal Trade, which in 2017 was subsequently converted into the CFTA. And since the AIT, now CFTA, there have been other domestic regional trade agreements within Canada. And this has been an incredible development if one looks at the span of the country's history of a push towards finding solutions to remedy internal trade barriers. And the dominant paradigm under these trade agreements has been the concept of national treatment. It's one where any province can set the terms of how a good is regulated, and so long as those same rules are applied to domestic goods as they are to goods coming from out of province, or labor in province as labor out of province, whatever the rule was fine. And this was what undergirded many global multilateral trade agreements are undergirded by the concept of national treatment, and so are most of Canada's domestic trade agreements. The Western Canadian Trade Agreement, the New West Partnership Trade Agreement, goes the farthest, as we found in this study, goes the farthest amongst all of them in introducing and pushing the concept of mutual recognition. And this is a slightly more aggressive form of a paradigm that you can use in a trade agreement, where you say, you know what, we will accept the rules and the conformity assessment bodies of Ontario. Say I'm in Alberta, will accept Ontario's method of determining whether or not a dentist is licensed, or whether or not a duvet has been produced according to standard, and then allow that to be imported and say that their rules are good enough for us. Part of our study examined the way that this was working abroad, and the dominant, two of the leading models. One could look at the European Union, which is a collection of separate federal states, or not sorry, federal, separate states under the umbrella of the EU, and the European Court of the Central European Court has a de facto constitutional mandate to sort of facilitate mutual recognition. The other one that's a lot more analogous to the Canadian context is in Australia, where you have the Australian Mutual Recognition Agreement, which creates this permeates the concept of mutual recognition, which dates back to the same era in the early 90s, where the rules set in one province or one state, one Australian state, are good enough for another. Of course, you can cabinet, you can create some carve-outs if there are some supremely local issues that sort of need to be taken off the table. For example, in Australia, one example has to do with fireworks, and and in Canada, part of the discussion is always we're a federal country, and to what extent do we want to give provinces the leeway to sort of say, this is still out of bounds, versus this is one economic union, and we're trying to create an engine of growth that can push us into the 21st century. And with that, I think I can pass the baton back.
Great. Thank you for that, Ryan. Trevor, we'll go over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Ryan, also for, I think, framing the concept of mutual recognition and how it fits within pre-existing agreements in Canada. And that's a real value added of the paper. So if there's anyone participating in the webinar here who hasn't yet checked it out, I definitely encourage you to do that at the Macdonald-Laurier website. Now, another aspect of the paper that we go through is examining and quantifying the potential benefits of mutual recognition as a tool to ease interprovincial trade barriers in Canada. And as the Premier noted at the top, we do find that those gains are quite large. Now, that itself, I don't think should be too surprising. I mean, the volume of trade across provincial and territorial borders today is roughly equivalent to nearly 1/5 of Canada's economy. And so even small frictions that inhibit the free flow of goods and services across provincial and territorial borders can have large macroeconomic implications for productivity, for prices, for incomes and standards of living of Canadians generally. So the quantitative work that we do in the paper is using the latest tools from international trade research, the latest data from Statistics Canada to really do two things. First, try and quantify how much scope there is for mutual recognition to lower internal trade costs in Canada. And we do that. I'm not going to go through the details verbally here. We map that out in the paper quite fully, but we try and estimate what the policy relevant barriers to trade are. And it will always be costly and time consuming to ship a good from Toronto to Vancouver. And some of that is just fundamental and unrelated to policy and is kind of a natural consequence as well of Canada's vast geography. But differences in rules, regulations, standards, certification, adds artificial and unnecessary costs to those transactions. So we measure these costs and find that depending on the method, they can vary between 8 to 22%. On average across those methods of about 15%. That's quite large. Imagine it's a hidden cost on interprovincial transactions equivalent to nearly triple the GST. Right? Now, it varies across sectors from a low of about 3% for manufactured goods, but higher for service sectors, finance at 28%, for example. So there's a range of costs that affects different sectors differently, but these costs have significant implications for Canada's overall economy and productivity. So that's the second thing that we do. Try and measure if we were to adopt comprehensive and broad-based mutual recognition, by how much might we expect Canada's GDP to increase? So in the biggest exercise that we do, we just presume and model a simulation where all provinces and all territorial governments adopt mutual recognition across the board, eliminating these policy relevant measures of trade. And we find that Canada's overall real GDP increases by between 4.4 and 7.9%. So those were the figures that Premier Kenney noted at the top. And those are kind of what translates in dollar terms to between 110 and $200 billion per year in foregone economic activity because of the inefficiencies created by these artificial costs to trade and operate businesses across provincial borders. But we go through a number of other exercises as well, because mutual recognition is a tool that can be deployed in different ways. The Premier, I think, very importantly noted that it is something that a province can unilaterally adopt. And that makes it quite unique, because if we're going to harmonize rules and regulations across jurisdictions, then you need explicit cooperation and agreement of multiple governments. But mutual recognition, where a single province just says that, well, whatever prevails in another province is automatically satisfactory to ours, that can be done just with that province acting alone. And so we try and measure what the gains from that would be, using Alberta just as an example to quantify some of those gains. So if Alberta were to unilaterally liberalize across the board, then its provincial real GDP would increase, we estimate, by between 2.5 and 4.1%. Now, that's slightly smaller than the gains that would materialize, that we find about 3 to 4% from overall nationwide mutual recognition, but it is most of the gains are available to a province just by acting unilaterally. We also estimate what it would mean to mutually recognize just within certain areas. Pick a sector and adopt mutual recognition in those sectors alone. And we find the gains are particularly large in sectors that are suppliers of inputs to other producers of goods and services elsewhere in the economy. Right? A lot of media attention on internal trade does focus on issues related to beer and wine trade, which has important barriers to it for sure. But the biggest economic implications of trade costs occur when they make it more costly for a business to source inputs from the most efficient and appropriate supplier, which might be located elsewhere in the country. And so we map that out kind of sector by sector. So I think I'll end there with my opening remarks, just, I guess, quickly summarizing that the economic implications of internal trade costs are large. Mutual recognition is a tool that can uniquely eliminate most of those internal trade barriers, leading to significant increases in Canada's overall productivity.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Trevor. Now, we've got a few questions. We've got a lot of questions from the audience as well, so I don't think we'll have any problem filling the last half hour with your thoughts, gentlemen. But I wanted to start by talking about some of the steps, both the Premier and yourselves, Ryan, in particular. You alluded to previous efforts to try and reduce these barriers, the Agreement on Internal Trade, the CFTA. Maybe I could get you to talk a bit about, why did that not succeed to the extent that we're seeing today with sort of Alberta's move to unilaterally remove barriers? What has been the obstacle with previous attempts to remove some of these trade barriers?
Absolutely. Before we even came to the paradigm of using interprovincial trade agreements under the Charlottetown Accord, Canada tried to run at this almost with a constitutional lens. Let's revise the Constitution itself to try to improve the economic union. And so when that door was shut, when the Charlottetown Accord did not go through, a bit more complicated than that, but the net of it is because that accord didn't go through, and sort of we haven't really reopened the concept of a constitutional convention. It's coming at it with these political agreements, which at the end of the day, any premier and any government can pull out of. So it requires absolute consensus the entire way through. You can't force anything on someone, and as soon as a government changes, and if it's not, an agreement that's that's to their liking, there's nothing to stop them. By and large, there's some mechanics to it. By and large, from just pulling out of the agreement, and there was a massive change to the interprovincial trade agreements in 2017 when it flipped from being the AIT to the CFTA, and it's a somewhat of a technical flip where it turned into a negative list where essentially parties to the agreement said everything under the sun is up for liberalization except for these carve-outs. And then, as Premier Kenney alluded to, you get this massive appendix with all the carve-outs, which sort of really neuters much of the agreement. And it comes down to political willpower. Political willpower on protecting, a little bit has to do with protecting stakeholders, both inside and outside of government. It comes down to the fact that a lot of issues that are interprovincial trade barriers involve many ministries at once, which may not always be aligned in terms of what they want, what their ideal outcomes are to a particular issue. A lot of regulatory disharmony. You look at construction codes as a perfect example across the country. Construction codes are so divergent, and there was this push under the RCT that was introduced under the CFTA to bring some harmony and allow producers and participants in that industry, in that sector, to be able to plan, to be able to do inventory, to be able to move labor across borders far easier. But a lot of it is these codes have been sort of snowballed for almost 100 years in many cases, and it's hard to pull back and point out to what is grounded in science versus this is just the way we've done it this whole entire time. And disrupting the normal course of our regulatory system takes political and monetary capital.
Yeah, I guess I'll quickly jump in to add to that by noting that past efforts and past agreements to liberalize internal trade have had measurable effects. I mean, there have been some previous research. A 2019 paper that I was involved in for the IMF, for example, tries to measure some of these past agreements. We find that, say, the New West Partnership Agreement, for example, we did measure that internal trade costs as a result of that agreement did decline. We measured by about 2%, and not nothing for sure. And the CFTA is also a meaningful agreement with important work being done through the RCT. The Premier at the top noted one of my favorite examples of the results of efforts there, and that's having the first aid kits that are harmonized across locations. And well, that, it's certainly a small example of the broader problem. I believe the estimates on the economic gains of just that alone are about $3 million per year. And so that accumulates, it's real. So the benefit cost ratio of all the important work being done at the RCT is certainly there. But relative to the size of the problem, it's incredibly slow. And so that's really where mutual recognition as a policy tool can really help move the needle in a much more significant way.
Fair enough. You'll imagine my shock at hearing that thickets of regulation are slowing down economic activity. That is a shocking revelation on my part. Earlier, Trevor, you talked about the clear benefits you've laid out, the clear economic benefits. Part of this paper is also about trade-offs. Maybe you could talk to us about what some of those trade-offs are, because I think it's clear what the upside is. But if we could talk about what maybe some of who is losing out as a result of this, because I think that will sort of shed light on what some of the political obstacles have been to getting there.
Sure. So that's an excellent question. I think more broadly, the political challenge to internal trade liberalization is in part similar to challenges related to international liberalization. And that is oftentimes those who benefit from certain measures know that they benefit from those measures, and they can quite clearly understand what the potential losses would be if we were to make it easier for buyers to source from other suppliers who might be potentially located elsewhere. And the gains are much less visible and more diffuse. We all, as tens of millions of consumers across the country, pay a little bit more, have a little bit lower productivity. That collectively is quite meaningful and adds up, but it's hard to see foregone sources of income or prices that in some counterfactual world would be lower. So the gains are harder to see, more diffuse, whereas the benefits of protectionist measures are often very concentrated and visible. And so it creates a very strong incentive for the beneficiary of those protectionist measures to push politically, if you will, for them to be maintained. More broadly, there are some other important trade-offs to liberalization internally that should be considered as well, and that's the gains that we estimate. For example, they should be thought of as longer-run productivity gains. You can't just snap your fingers and have the economy readjust into a more efficient allocation of output and labor and capital, for example. And so that readjustment does come with some important adjustment costs, right? Having individuals and businesses change the size of their output, for example. And to the extent that some of the adjustment costs are maybe borne by individuals, or maybe there are certain regions of the country that might be disadvantaged, there might be a role for government to help facilitate that adjustment or ease those costs, especially to address equity concerns that might result. There's also, I think, some fiscal implications of internal trade liberalization that should be kept in mind, and that's that different regions will benefit by different amounts. Okay. Now, luckily, in Canada's case, we estimate, and others have as well, that the gains are larger for lower income regions of the country, and so we could achieve equity and regional efficiency outcomes there. But paying careful thought to the allocation of those gains and losses from liberalization, I think, should be a part of the conversation for sure.
Okay, Ryan, any thoughts?
No, I think Trevor really hit a lot of the issues on the head there.
Sure. Then maybe I'll ask you a question, Ryan, about the other models. I mean, you mentioned the European Union, you mentioned the Australian model, and I think the Premier talked a bit about that model in terms of the mutual recognition. It seems very straightforward and intuitive. Could you expand on it a little bit more? Is there anything else that people should know about the Australian model, or anything about that model that might not transfer well to the Canadian situation?
Absolutely, and yeah, the premier at the top, he did sort of describe it very well. I mean, we take you can look at how the Australian interstate agreement handles the movement of labor, and the idea is if you're moving from one jurisdiction to another within Australia, the onus is that you merely so say you're a licensed and you fall within the parameters of the agreement. Say, but it's an architect, for example, is one specific example. You go from one Australian state to another, the onus is on that mover to notify the local regulatory body, the state, the new home state's regulatory body, and then it's up to the regulator to examine the credentials, and they are deemed fit to practice. Essentially, they are deemed fit to practice until such time within 30 days that the regulator says, you know what, actually, we looked at your capabilities, and actually, what they do over in Queensland isn't exactly what we do in New South Wales. So let's have a revisit, and there's a protocol put in place, and that's one thing that sort of it would be really really important to see if Canada goes down, if policymakers in Canada go down the route of implementing a mutual recognition agreement amongst, even if it's just two provinces, but if it's a pan-Canadian mutual recognition agreement, what it really needs to have is the infrastructure and the mechanism in place so that it spells out the process for the movement of labor. What is the expectation of a new entrant to a new province? What is the process that they're supposed to go through? What are the appeal mechanisms in place for them to say, I don't like the way that you assess my credentials. I think I'm actually fit to practice here because they do it just fine in Quebec and I'm now here in Alberta. And I want to appeal what your local decision was. Um, and I think that that's important. I think it creates predictability. If someone's going to uproot themselves and move, they've trained for years in one province trying to move to another, they need that certainty that they're going to be able to transport those credentials, because that's a big change in their lives. And if you want to see the free movement of labor to where it's most effective or efficiently allocated, one issue would be sort of creating that certainty. Another example that comes from Australia is I mean, the way that the literature looks at the Australian example is looking at what made it work so well, and one of the items was the fact that Australia is one sovereign nation, and within it, you're dealing with subnational jurisdictions, and so there's a great degree of trust amongst the regulators. You'd think within one state, and that's the case in Canada. So, what are the ingredients for success in Australia? Many of them exist in Canada. You've got same language, same culture, and broadly speaking, same sort of culture, same sense of same regulatory framework, same legal framework. There's so much of what was going on in Australia that makes the Canadian example ripe for some manifestation of an MRA.
Okay. Trevor, maybe I can go to you because you mentioned earlier, you talked a little bit about the role that the federal government can have in sort of smoothing over some of the frictions. And I think that's a sort of broader question I want to put to you about the role of the federal government in helping remove some of these barriers. I think we know you touched on some of the political incentives that provinces may face. They may face very sort of vocal constituencies who have a lot to lose. What else can the federal government do to help expedite this process and frankly help the provinces overcome these sort of perverse incentives that they're facing?
Sure. So I think one thing that the federal government can and has been doing in recent years across parties is really make internal trade an issue and convene provinces and regularly ensure it's an issue on the agenda at these first ministers' meetings, for example, and just keep pushing the issue forward. And so that is an important role that they can, as the central government can play. There's also an important role, especially in Canada, where the capacities of provincial governments varies pretty considerably, especially between the larger provincial governments and the smaller ones. You may have provinces that just don't have internal capacity to potentially take on some of the work that might be required in harmonizing or reconciling or studying some of the issue. And so the federal government can play a role in helping augment that provincial capacity. And we saw that actually recently with some boosted funding for the secretariat that is behind the CFTA is just one example. But directly, the Premier noted a couple very important areas related to transactions where the federal government has a direct role, right? Agricultural inspections being a big one. There has been some moves to improve that, I believe, for blueberries and potatoes recently. I think that work is finishing up and ensuring that there's not just duplicated effort on the part of the federal government. If there's been an inspection done provincially, then that can be the end of it, rather than having it done at multiple points across the transaction. And then there are also sectors that are under direct federal jurisdiction. I'm thinking telecommunications, air transportation, sectors like this, and procurement. This is an area where provinces and the federal government are large buyers of goods and services. And it's not uncommon for governments to have biased procurement processes to favor certain sectors, certain locations, having explicit sometimes preferences for local suppliers to the government. And so ensuring that federal procurement, for example, is not itself adding to any of the interprovincial distortion is another important way in which the federal government can help contribute to improving things going forward.
Great, thank you. Ryan, I wanted to ask you, as I've got a question here about constitutionality and the constitutional balance. Of course, in Canada, there's a division of powers in the Constitution. The federal government can do some things and the provinces can do others. Do you see any sort of limits on the federal government's powers to help help reduce barriers? In other words, are there things that are beyond the constitutional purview of the federal government to do, and it really is going to be up to the provinces in some of these areas to remove some of these barriers?
That's a really good question, Aaron. And coming in and you kind of say, okay, well, is there an actor in this system that can come in and sort of, if there are lots of vested interests coming at a provincial government, can some overlaying actor come in and help disrupt that and create some liberalization where sort of there's inertia, perhaps? Part of the issue is that a lot of the topics that get caught in the concept, like much of interprovincial trade barriers are in non-tariff, they're regulations, disharmonious regulations. They're in technical regulations and in standards and in measures that are governed constitutionally by they fall under the jurisdiction of provinces. So it's a little difficult for the federal government to start rearranging regulations. That's not really their scope of power. They can't come in and start changing driving license restrictions or what it means to be a doctor in province A versus province B. They are merely they have their jurisdiction set out under the Constitution. What they do have, and sort of one line of thinking on this topic has been using the federal government's spending powers to help encourage changes in provincial regulation in line with what might be more liberalized forms. Using financial incentives from the federal government to push coordination amongst subnational jurisdictions. You see this in the United States, where the federal government uses highway spending to encourage states to keep drinking the drinking age at 21. And that creates a level of harmony across the United States. That's using the power of the purse, if you will, to go as far as using that term to describe the powers of the federal government. There are, as Professor Tombe speaks to, there are some areas where the regulation, the technical regulations, the regional preference programs put in place by the federal government are what creates the trade barrier, and so it would be fully within the power of the federal government to address it. But most of the time, this is where, under this, on the the federal, the Harper government's concept of open federalism, which was we're going to respect the jurisdiction of the provinces. And so, how do you square that with the idea of, oh, well, we want to ensure that there's some harmony across the provincial regulatory schemes, and that's getting provinces on board with one another and agreeing using this concept that's very, this concept of a trade agreement to say, hey, let's all tie our hands when it comes to these certain issues, for the betterment of the economic union, rather than having a sort of a set a rule imposed on us from above telling us how we should create one rule. It's we're respecting each other's jurisdictions, and in doing so, we're expressing our autonomy as a province by saying that we'll accept province B's or province A's rules when it comes to a profession or way you regulate a good.
Fair enough. Trevor, maybe I could ask you this question. I got a question about the implications for Canada's internal market if not all CFTA parties agree to provide mutual recognition. Now, I'm guessing, is it just a question that because provinces can act unilaterally, is it just the provinces that choose not to are just losing out on most of the benefits?
That is an important issue because, as the Premier even noted, this concept of mutual recognition is one where uniquely it can allow for unilateral moves by provincial government. And there are important implications of that for other provinces. So the one adopting unilateral recognition of the standards and certifications elsewhere, that province can achieve most of the economic gains we estimate from that are available from multilateral national mutual recognition. But there are national gains as well, but there's something called trade diversion that can occur, where output production shifts into the liberalizing province away from others. And so there can be negative economic implications for other regions as a result of a unilateral action by one province. So we don't map that out in detail in the paper, but hopefully the intuition is fairly straightforward. Now, importantly, in Canada, we have a great deal of fiscal redistribution that takes place through the federal budget, raising more in revenue from some locations and having larger expenditure in others. And this, of course, raises a host of other issues that I guess goes beyond our conversation today. But it has the effect of provinces that have increases in their level of economic activity end up having some of that redistributed elsewhere in the country. And so that fiscal redistribution that itself can respond to changing economic circumstances, it turns out, does ensure that all provinces in Canada would have increases in real income, even as a result of a single province moving unilaterally. So I think that was a long-winded answer maybe to your question, but hopefully kind of illustrates that even one province moving alone can create national economic benefits.
Now, that's a very interesting point about the trade diversion. And so I'm wondering, in theory at least, if a province that acts unilaterally, so say one province acts unilaterally, they stand to reap most of the gain. Can another province that stands to lose, can they mitigate that by themselves moving to implement mutual recognition?
So precisely right. And so it does create that incentive to kind of ratchet towards liberalization. So that dynamic is certainly there, yes.
Interesting. I got a question about Quebec in particular, and I think this pertains to your point earlier, Ryan, when you're saying that the reason Australia is such a good model is that unlike the EU, we're a single state with subnational units. But I think the argument here would be Quebec has somewhat different interests. They see themselves sometimes differently than the rest of the country, and so they may be more reluctant than, say, an Australian state would be to lower some of their barriers. So what do you say to that? Is it irrelevant because, as we know, you can have unilateral action, or does this pose a sort of unique obstacle to the gains from trade here?
It's very interesting you asked this question because Quebec was actually one of the leaders when it came to drafting the agreement on internal trade back in the early '90s because under Jacques Parizeau getting ready for potentially leaving Canada, it was like, well, how are we going to remain together? Well, it's going to be by a framework of a free trade agreement. And so actually, when you think about it in context, in historical context, Quebec saw it as a way to maintain an economic relationship with Canada, so some factions within Quebec anyways, while also gaining independence. Or at least taking more control. Where Quebec sits now, 25 years later, it sort of political motives have changed, and it's ever shifting. I mean, you look at British Columbia, and under the NDP government before Gordon Campbell, they were firmly against free trade, firmly against interprovincial free trade, and then the Gordon Campbell government comes in, and there's a 180-degree shift, and BC and Alberta subsequently enter into what would become the newest trade partnership agreement. It really depends on the political philosophies of who's in charge of a province at any given time, and it can shift. It can shift in the course of an election, like it was in BC, and it can shift in the course of demographic and political change, perhaps going in the other way when it comes to Quebec. But you're right. And the idea of a trade agreement requiring consensus building is what underpins it. That being said, there is this idea, and it exists within the CFTA and the Northwest Trade Partnership Agreement, is what are the enforcement mechanisms we're going to put in place to make sure that, if we get people to agree to something, provinces to agree to liberalize, and they're not owning up to the mutual recognition obligations they signed up for, how can we pull them back in? And that's an interesting conversation outside the scope of this paper. But the idea is, can we, create greater cost to a province for breaching its obligations under that trade agreement? What can we do when it comes to the dispute mechanism and the enforcement mechanism? And that is something to be considered if policymakers are going to go down the route of a mutual recognition agreement amongst unilateral or multilateral one in Canada's situation. How can we enforce the obligations that they've signed up for, which I think is an interesting conversation.
That's great. I'm told that Premier Kenney would like to rejoin the conversation, so I'm very pleased to welcome him back in for some comments.
Sorry, I thought I was there all along. Can you hear me, Aaron?
I absolutely can.
I know I'm kind of busting into this, but very interesting. I just wanted to add, as a practitioner, some of the dynamics that I've observed. First of all, you asked about the federal interest. When I speak to a lot of federal ministers, they're keenly interested. They want to get involved because it's a cost-free way of them showing that they're nation builders, and good for them. And I think the ministers of the current federal cabinet who actually care about such arcane concerns like economic growth, productivity, they actually see the gains here. But none of them are willing to advocate for using the constitutional superpowers. And so, I was talking to one federal minister who said, how about I convene a meeting and I just lock all of you guys from all the provinces in a room and say you're not allowed out until you get an EU style agreement? I said, well, good luck. When it comes to the provinces, where I see the strongest preferences that are protectionism, it tends to be around procurement, like road building and things like that. You've got these huge disputes between Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Quebec, because perhaps unsurprisingly, Quebec exercises very strong preferences for its domestic contractors. And we have had some disputes with Saskatchewan on that stuff. But generally speaking, I would say, and here's the weird thing, there is not a high level of conscious protectionism that informs the stasis in which we are locked here. It is just stasis is what it is. This is never a bright, shiny object. It's not a front page issue. There is no cohort of the electorate. This goes to public choice economics. There's no, apart from the odd business group that adds this on as a predictable point in their occasional policy pieces, or guys like you in the C.D. Howe Institute, apart from the odd policy piece, there is no concentrated political benefit to advocate for this. And so it gets crowded out. But when you're in a job like mine, you're dealing with a million issues concurrently. Most of your attention is sucked up by the most urgent matters, or the short-term gains that you can get. So a boring technical grind where you see remote and long-term benefits does not work in the political calculus really to become a real priority. When we talk about these issues around the Council of the Federation table, everybody says all the right things. They repeat all of the right bromides about the importance of free trade for about 20 minutes, sandwiched into 12 agenda items in a day-and-a-half long meeting, and then they go back to their capitals and let some ADM in their IGR department worry about it. So I just think it requires my peers saying, no, to hell with it. This actually is a priority. And I do think that, if the feds were actually do what Trevor suggests and actually convene a national summit on this, and we were to build up some expectations around that and have a sustained effort by think tanks, academics, business organizations, and others in a really focused way to break through, maybe we can move past the stasis. But I think my conclusion, ultimately, the only way we're going to get past stasis is pretty much unilateral action.
Fair enough. Great insights from someone who would know. And I'm hoping at least that we can call it desperation to find economic growth anywhere we can may move this up on the priority list for not only the federal government, but all provinces as well. Well, it's right at the top of the hour, so I think we're out of time, but I want to thank everybody for this fascinating discussion. I want to thank you, Premier Kenney, again for joining us and for commissioning this paper. We're very, very proud to commission Professor Tombe and Ryan on this. I want to thank you, the authors, for joining us, and I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us today, and we'll wish you a very good afternoon.